Good morning. Today we're going to go over a few important points regarding the composition of a portfolio. Portfolio is an important aspect of any application as it presents your critical work, your creative work, to the school. We're going to try to outline a few of the most important points that you should consider as you're putting together your portfolio for your college application. When composing a portfolio, you want to make sure that you choose only your best work. Quality is always most important over quantity. So as you look through the work that you have produced during your time in high school, I would encourage you to compile it, lay it out before you, and critically select only the best work that you believe represents your creative abilities. I should stress that this work need not be solely the work of architecture. You can choose creative poems. You may also select from photography, models, creative projects that might lie outside of a conventional architectural drawing course are welcome, in fact, as they show breadth of creative potential. I would also encourage you that you seek the advice of others, perhaps a faculty member at the school that can also look through the work with you and make the proper selections. You want to make sure that once all of the work that you've collected is before you, you can actually select a variety of work. It is good to show a kind of range of work, and so if you have photographs as well as perhaps poetry or architectural projects or models, it is, I think, interesting for those receiving the portfolio to be able to see a kind of cross-section or a sampling of that work. What is important once you've compiled the work is that you scan it properly. What I mean by that is you need to analyze the size of the material, of the original material. If it's small enough to be able to be placed on a flatbed, you can do that on a small flatbed scanner. Today, most iPhone cameras are also perhaps even better than flatbed scanners and would allow you to take very good reproductions of the work. However, you want to make sure that the work is properly aligned, that it's well lighted, and at the very minimum is scanned, I would recommend, at 300 dpi. 300 dpi ensures that the quality of the reproduction remains of the highest quality for the portfolio. I would also recommend, depending upon the size of the overall image, that you actually scan the information at 300 dpi and roughly at the size that you want it to appear in the portfolio. What I mean by that is if the original drawing was 24 by 36, for instance, you may not want to scan it at 300 dpi with an overall size of 24 by 36 because this will make the file very, very large and oftentimes cumbersome to handle. However, you can scan the original 24 by 36 drawing at 300 dpi, but at a scale that is more commensurate with the final output, say an 8 by 10 or 8.5 by 11. This will allow you to maintain a high quality of reproduction while making the information easier to manage. Generally speaking, the portfolio should contain a number of elements, and they're spelled out here in terms of an overall contents page. You want a cover, which usually means an outer cover of some sort to identify the portfolio. A title page, which could be called essentially a kind of interior cover, if you will. Depending, you may or may not choose to include a resume, and this could be placed at the very beginning of the portfolio, but is oftentimes best seen at the end. You will also be required to list a table of contents, and that table of contents should be able to illustrate the list of projects that you will be showing in the portfolio. And then, of course, you will be asked to display the various projects. Projects should contain some sort of cover sheet with a very brief introduction or text describing the project, and then typically 1 to 2 spreads for each of the projects that you are including in the portfolio. Of course, this may be expanded in the instance that you may have, for instance, a photographic essay that might contain 6 or 7 photographs. Then obviously the number of spreads in that particular case would be larger. But in general, you're probably looking at 2 to 3 spreads per project. A spread is essentially a double-page sheet for those of you who might not be familiar with the term. The first thing that you want to consider is the size of the portfolio. The sizes of the overall pages are important. This is actually an image by Massimo Vignelli, probably one of the most important 20th century graphic designers of our time. This is an image reproduced from the Vignelli canon, where it displays the various sizes of the A1 series, which is a European series of papers. And you can see that the preferences in Vignelli's case for this series come from the fact that the A1 series is proportioned based on the golden ratio, which he believes is a much more elegant proportion than our more American standards, which typically default to an 8.5 by 11 size sheet of paper. While I would generally agree with Vignelli and his recommendations, the reality is that we are practicing in the United States, and most of you will have to reproduce your portfolios in the US, and therefore using the A1 series might be a little bit more challenging and might require custom printing. Therefore, what I would recommend is that you research and think about how it is that you will actually reproduce your portfolio in order to be able to print it according to certain standards. Now, for those of you who are asked to submit digital portfolios, and this is currently the case at the University of Miami School of Architecture, you do have the liberty to actually select the European sizing, because you're not required to have to print it on paper, but rather to submit it electronically. So I would keep this in mind, and for those of you who might be more interested in learning a little bit more about Vignelli's theories of composition, I would recommend that you research and download the Vignelli Canon by Massimo Vignelli, where he illustrates the various elements that are critical in the composition of a page, really, and that, of course, beginning with the selection of the size of the paper. Here I'm showing you an example. Of course, this is a publication of the renowned architect Adolf Loos, but it's an example of, let's say, a cover, an overall cover seen here on the left, and an interior cover seen here on my right. And on the left, you'll see that the last name is spelled up at the top, overlaid over a black and white image of one of Loos's interiors. On the interior, you'll see that the name is spelled out in a different typeface with a subtitle for the text, and of course the name of the publisher at the bottom. Now obviously in your case, this is not going to be a publication, but rather simply an illustration of how one can have an outside cover as well as an interior title page that gives you similar information but laid out in different formats. In the case of the table of contents, the contents page can be quite straightforward and simple. Here you see from the same book a contents page that includes contents at the very, very top with a list which has page numbers to the left and the various project names to the right, beginning with the introduction and of course ending in this case with the bibliography and the credits. For many of you, you will likely have fewer projects than what are listed here on this contents page. So I would recommend that you list the name of the project, perhaps the year in which you made the work, and even perhaps the faculty member that helped guide you in that effort. In that way, you might have 3 lines per each project in the contents page, and it will allow you to extend the information in a column similar to what you see here on this slide. Another consideration to keep in mind are very important aspects of the design of the portfolio. In fact, a fundamental aspect of the design of our portfolio is the design of the grid, which is the underlying structure or the foundation that sets the organization for the overall composition of the various pages. Here we see 3 such examples where you see a 2x4 grid, a 3x6 grid, and a 4x8 grid, which are basically repeated over a spread in a typical portfolio. What does the grid allow you to do? The grid allows you to organize the information, setting up a series of what we call datum lines or reference lines for the organization of both text and image. This is important because it will allow the portfolio to have a certain unity and will allow you to organize not only within a particular project, but between the projects that you select to illustrate in the portfolio. So as you begin, or as you work through the collection of the work, begin with laying out a foundational grid that will allow you to better compose your selected images. Here's another 2 examples. In this particular case, the grid is being oriented vertically as opposed to the previous examples that I showed you. And the reason to choose perhaps a vertical grid over a horizontal grid may have something to do with the types of proportions of the primary work that you've selected. What I mean by that is that if the majority of your work is in the vertical orientation, you may choose a vertically oriented grid to organize the page. Whereas if the majority of your projects are landscape, meaning a horizontal format, you may desire to choose the horizontal grid as a way of better organizing the overall sheets. In addition to the grid, you will need to compose not just images, but also text. Here we see an excerpt, again, from the Vignelli canon, where Vignelli lays out a column of text on the left, divided by a series of margins that then placed images to the right. It seems like a relatively straightforward layout, but you can see how the spacing in between the columns of text is equal to the spacing in between the various images. So the proportions between images has been considered very, very carefully. Now, you will likely have far less text on your pages than what you see here in this particular page. But something that you will keep in mind is that when you introduce a new project, it is a good idea to give a small text describing the project that will follow, a very small or brief description. This can be basically the length of a paragraph. And what you'll want to keep in mind is that the length, or I should say the width of that paragraph in terms of the number of words should roughly be 7 to 10 words per column, and probably of a size approximately of 12 points. In addition to that text, you will likely also have to include headings for the various projects as well as captions, and we will discuss this in a minute. When talking about type in a portfolio, this is a very important consideration in the composition of your particular portfolio, as you will not only be including images, but you will need to describe those images through the selection of type. I would say that there's 2 leading criteria for the selection of type in any graphic work. One is legibility. You want to be able to understand clearly the words on the printed page. And then I think that there would be a secondary, or perhaps not secondary, but equally important consideration, which is an aesthetic choice for what type of typeface will you select and how will it be arranged on the page. Serving as a suggestion for you, and again, taking clues from Vignelli's canon, he illustrates a number of typefaces who, in a sense, have withstood the test of time. They have rich families of bold caps, italicized fonts. They're highly legible, beautifully proportioned, and as you put together your portfolio, if you're having trouble, choosing a typeface, I would recommend that perhaps you consider one of these that you see here on the slide, which is Garamond, Bodoni, or Century Expanded. These are all what we call serif fonts, or Futura, Times Roman, or of course the classic Helvetica typeface. In the case of Futura and Helvetica, these are sans serif texts, considered to be more contemporary text, alongside Times Roman, which is actually probably one of the most utilized typefaces in print because of its extreme legibility. I'm showing you here a two-page spread in that same book that we were looking at the beginning of the presentation on Adolf Loos. And once again, the layout has more text than your layout will likely have, but it will contain, or it does contain, some of the key elements that are necessary in the composition of, let's say, a double-page spread in a portfolio. On the left, you see a large image of the interior of the cafe, which is among the most important views of the project. Here you see it large and in color. And on the right, you see the year of the project at the very top, followed by the title of the project, which is an immediate identifier for the project, underneath which lies the location of the project. Below that, you see a body of text that describes the project, and to the left, you see a black and white exterior image of the cafe. In addition to that, you will note that there are captions seen underneath the small image, where in bold you have the title of the caption, and below you have a short description of the particular image. So in this relatively simple composition, you find two different types of images at two different scales. One thing to keep in mind is that the larger the image, the more important it is in the composition of the graphic page. Hierarchically, it commands not only a larger surface area, but a larger visual presence, and so therefore it is considered the most important of the elements on the page. It's also, in this particular case, in color. That is the image on the left, and therefore even gains greater hierarchy. What you will notice is that while you cannot see the grid in this particular case, you can see how there is a grid being used to organize the sheet. You see how the top of the image of that colored interior of the cafe lines up with the top of the black and white image of the cafe from the street, alongside the top of the image of the text. Conversely, the same occurs at the bottom of the sheet, where the bottom of the color image lines up with the bottom of the caption, the lower caption, as well as the bottom of the description of the project. The title itself frees itself from that grid line, those two grid lines, and occupies the top sort of center of the page. And so the various elements come together in a considered composition that immediately has both a sense of hierarchy and a sense of balance. Again, these are just a few rules of thumb in terms of the overall composition. I think we alluded to them earlier, but when including a paragraph, a descriptive paragraph, generally speaking, you want to include 7 to 10 words per line, typically at 10 to 12 points. If you're looking at a sheet of paper that is roughly an 8.5 by 11. Headings, of course, should be in proportion to the overall text on the page. So for instance, if the overall typeface for the paragraph is 10 points, you can consider a 20-point header. And then finally, your captions can typically include a short title as well as maybe a simple description. This usually has to do with the medium. So for instance, if you're including a watercolor painting that you did, you can place in the caption the title of the painting, below it, watercolor on a particular type of paper of a particular size. So it becomes descriptive of the work itself. Once again, the captions should be the smallest of the typefaces, somewhere between 8 and 9 points. Once again, I'm using an example of a spread from a book, which is, of course, different. This is a built work, but I think it illustrates a couple of points that you may want to keep in mind. This is actually a project spread that was laid out using a similar grid to the ones that I showed you earlier in the presentation. And what you will notice is that even though it's using what might be considered a rigid grid, that grid allows for infinite amount of variations and a layout that I would argue is quite syncopated. What do I mean by that? The opening pages of the book or of the project is a double-page spread where one image occupies 2 sides of the pages of a book, and the only thing that we see at the very, very top is the title of the project itself. This is, of course, followed by a more columnar organization of information where you have a site plan and you have a description of the project and a few basic drawings. Then these are followed by 3 sheets that have 2 images on each sheet that are basically being mirrored in terms of a size and overall placement. And what you will notice here is the importance of the relationship between the figure and the field. Quite a bit of half of the page is left for white space, or is left blank, in fact. And rather than appearing empty, it appears as part of the composition, providing relief from the very large images that you see on the right or on the left of the various pages. Remember that what you're seeing here are photographs of built work. This could be replaced with photographs that you've taken. They could be replaced with the best drawings that you've produced. They can be replaced even with poems. So I would urge you to look at this more in terms of composition than in terms of the actual content of the images that are being illustrated. And then finally, the project ends, or the project's final image is another large double-page spread looking at the project from the opposite direction. So it has a clear beginning and a clear end. I think that this is a good way to illustrate how utilizing a well-organized grid can hold a project together while still providing variety and a syncopated rhythm, which is welcome when looking through a portfolio application. Finally, and again, for the purposes of the University of Miami, we will be accepting digital submittals, which will make things easier for all of you. But in the case of those of you who might need to print your portfolios, keep in mind, do a little bit of research. There are many resources out there today that allow individuals to print out their work in book formats. One such production house is blurb.com. And the reason that I'm mentioning it here is because if the final outcome beyond your submittal to the university also requires you to have to do some sort of physical printout for the book, research these sources, which are quite economical and important to consider because many of them already have set standards for their sheet sizes. The standards for the typical ones for Blurb are listed here on this slide, ranging from a small square to a large landscape. And the reason that this is important prior to beginning to design the portfolio is because you have an understanding of perhaps one of the first criteria that we spoke about, which is the size of the paper. And so once again, if you feel like you will need to print your portfolio and would like to use one of these resources, it's important for you early on to determine that critical question, which is the overall size and dimensions of the portfolio itself. This is really the end of the presentation. It's meant to be an initial introduction to some of the important considerations that you should bear in mind when putting your portfolio together. I hope, and we hope, that this provides a bit of insight and guidance, and we wish you the best of luck as you put together your finest work and submit it for consideration. Thank you very much.